Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Sable, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright children, today we're going to have another apocryphal story. Now this story is going to actually cover two different periods. The period of the Maccabees and also the period of Nehemiah, because today we're going to be discussing the story of the Feast of Hanukkah and the fire of Nehemiah. So, to start off, in the Gospel of John chapter 10, we hear how Jesus celebrated the Feast of Dedication. This is a reference to the Feast of Hanukkah. Now, many people have heard of the Feast of Hanukkah and its connection to the Maccabees. So, 100+ years before the birth of Jesus is when the Maccabees lived. And so who were the Maccabees? Well, after the Emperor Alexander the Great had died, his kingdom was divided into four, and the region of Persia came under the control of the Seleucids. And one of the emperors in the Seleucid dynasty was Emperor Antiochus Epiphanes. And he came down and he started to persecute the Jews in Israel. And he did many nasty things. One, he desecrated the temple of God by setting up a statue of Zeus in the temple. He also forced the Jews to eat pig meat and wouldn't let them get circumcised or celebrate any of their Jewish festivals. And so a man named Judas, called Maccabees, meaning the hammerer, because he was strong like a hammer, he rose up and led an army of people to defeat Antiochus's armies and drove them out of Israel. And after they had defeated the Seleucids, they went about rededicating the temple. So they removed the naughty statue of Zeus, and then they went about cleansing the temple. Now there is a later Jewish story that appeared sometime in the 1st century about this supposed miracle of oil, in which that the Maccabees only had enough oil to burn for one day, and it would take 8 days to make more oil, and that the Jews decided to light the menorah, or the 7-stand lampstand that was in the temple of Jerusalem. They decided to light it, and that it miraculously burned for 8 days. Now that miracle is never ever mentioned in the book of Maccabees itself. And actually, the connection with fire and the lighting of the menorah goes back to the time of Nehemiah and an even older story. And so, our story of Nehemiah's fire goes back even further to the beginning of the Babylonian exile. So, according to the book of 2nd Maccabees, when the Babylonian emperor, King Nebuchadnezzar, and his armies came to capture the city of Jerusalem and carry the Jews off into exile, seeing that Nebuchadnezzar was going to destroy the temple of God, one of the priests went into the temple and went up to the menorah, or the 7-pointed lampstand, and he took some of the eternal flame, because the flame was meant to always be burning, and he took some of the fire and he ran outside and he found a dried out cistern. So a cistern's like a well, and this one was all dried out, and he put some of the fire in the cistern to keep it safe, so that when Nebuchadnezzar's army came in and destroyed the menorah and destroyed the temple of God and burnt it to the ground, he was hoping that there would be some of the fire kept safe in the cistern. And now 70 years later, the Jews returned to the land of Jerusalem, and under the guidance of Ezra and Zerubbabel, they rebuilt the temple of God. And we read in the book of Nehemiah how Nehemiah, the cupbearer of the emperor, was sent back to Jerusalem to help him in setting up Jerusalem. And the book of Maccabees tells us that this is the origins of the Feast of Purification, or as we call it, the Feast of Chanukkah. That even before the Maccabees were around, the Jews under Nehemiah had established the first Feast of Chanukkah. And according to 2nd Maccabees, what happened is that when Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem, he instructed the Jews, and particularly the priests, that they needed to purify the temple of God in order to rededicate the temple to God. And as they were doing this, one of the priests came and told Nehemiah about this story he'd been told about how one of the priests had taken some of the flame off the altar and had preserved it in a cistern. And Nehemiah went, "Great! Then we can just use some of the old flame to relight the lampstand now. So go and get it." But when the priests ran off to get the fire, they looked in the cistern, and all they found was this black, oily soot kind of stuff. The fire had gone out, and now they didn't know what to do. And so Nehemiah instructed them to get a jar and to scoop up that black, sooty, oily mixture and to bring it to Nehemiah. Then they took some animals and they sacrificed them and put them on the altar. And then Nehemiah said, "Take some of the black, sooty oil and pour it on the sacrifice." And so they did. And they waited. And according to 2nd Maccabees, during the day, the sun had been behind the clouds. And at this point in time, as the high priest poured the oil mixture onto the sacrifices, the sun came out from behind the clouds. And as the sun rays hit the oil, they burst into flame and consumed the sacrifice. Then Nehemiah instructed that there was some rocks over there and that they should pour some of the oil on the rocks as well. So they went and they took this black sooty oil and they poured it on the rocks. And again, as soon as the sunlight hit this black mixture, burst into flame. And then Nehemiah instructed the priest to take some of the fire and to use it to relight the lampstand. So the high priest used the fire from the rocks to relight the lampstand, and according to the story, at that moment the fire on the rocks went out, and that the Jews continued to light the lampstand using the eternal fire from the lampstand. And according to the book of 2nd Maccabees, this then is the origins of the original Feast of Chanukkah, the original Feast of Purification and dedication of the temple, and was also known as the Feast of Fire, which is why the Feast of Hanukkah was also sometimes known as the Feast of Lights. Not because of some oil miracle with the Maccabees, but because of the miracle of Nehemiah's fire. And so this is why Judas Maccabeus chose that day to rededicate the temple and to celebrate the Feast of Purification by purifying the temple from all the abominations that Antiochus and Epiphanes had put into the temple. And so that then, children, is the story of Chanukkah and Nehemiah's fire. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.